Just put a bit of adhesive on that piece of paper. I'm just using contact cement there. Just take a blob of that. I just want it on about 4 spots on the back here. That'll probably do. And then this can go back in place. Just check that those holes line up, and they do. So that part's ready to pop back in the camera. So that little notch went to the top. So let's bring this, oh actually I'll put a little bit of grease around the edge of that outer helical here where it runs up against the back face of this, just to make sure that that'll run smoothly. That'll do. This just goes up underneath here like this. You can see 4 holes there. These screws are short. They're quite chunky looking screws, these ones. They're the outer screws. The size of these screws is identical to those used to hold the accessory shoes on the later Retinas. But these screws are nickel plated, and the screws holding accessory shoes will be chrome plated. Right, so they're all in place. Do those 4 screws up. Here I'm supporting this front standard between finger and thumb. I'm not pressing down on the struts, and check that this moves smoothly. And it does. Right, so I'll collapse the bellows, the struts, and there are 4 screws that hold the struts, to hold the bellows to the back of the struts. So I'll get them in place. They're quite long. They are a smaller size. Now they're not picking up the holes in the bellows. Oh, now it is. They weren't picking up on the holes in the plate on the bellows. Now that screw head looks a bit proud of the other ones. Let's make sure that's screwed down tight. That's better. Okay, so if I extend the front, now the bellows are attached, and that's all nice and light tight. So this lacks its focus scale ring, which is here. Now we've got an alignment mark here. If I can get this into position, where are we? Right there. There's an alignment mark scratched across both of those rings. And I can see the little marks where the screw heads bit into the focus scale ring previously. so I can be quite happy that I've got that alignment correct. So I've got 4 little screws here which hold that focus scale ring in place. And I thought I had my parts well sorted, but I see that the screw I've got sitting there is not the right one. So it's sitting over here waiting for me to find it. Wait, I'll be back in a second. One small screw looks just like another until you come to use them. Alright, so I'll nip those 4 screws up. You don't need to go mad doing those up, you'll only end up distorting something and making the action stiff. And the focus here is nice and smooth. That works really well. And of course, hard round here is the infinity position. Well, I can close up the front of the struts for the moment and think about my next move. Well, here's our front door. I never did remove that screw from the bottom of the door. I didn't think there was any point in fighting with it, so we'll just reinstall this basically as the reverse of the way I took the thing apart. A little put a wipe of grease through that pivot point there where the screw goes. One at the top for good measure. Some in this slot. And some in this slot. Now I've got to wriggle this thing together. This spring is our problem. It's got to be tucked into the side of the body here without scratching everything to death. Let's get this on first. That's on. Now I need to tuck that spring in. I also want to get that screw into its pivot position down there. I'll find a my little rule and see if I can use that to hold that spring back out of the way while I get this thing wriggled into position. Well, my rule appears to be hiding somewhere, so let's try this with this piece of strap instead. Okay, let's see if I can wriggle this pin into position. I can. I'll get the top screw in position. Whoops, that wasn't it. Just recover that screw. It's a bit hard getting this hole lined up because I've got the spring pressure here from that spring acting to push things out of alignment. Just drop the screw again. There you go, third time's the charm. Okay, so the door's back on, and it does open, and it does close. It even pops nicely. So we have the rewind in place. Our focus stuff is all in place. The bottom of the camera now just lacks its leather and the depth of field dials. And then we can assemble the film advance. This is what the other leather all looked like prior to being cleaned and reinstalled. So I have now to set to clean this leather, get all the old adhesive and rubbish off the back of it, all that white stuff which is aluminium corrosion products, and clean some of the mess off the outside of this, and that can be glued back on the base of the camera. Now none of that is very exciting. This just involves scraping to remove all that rubbish and any loose adhesive, all the adhesive if it's possible, but certainly the loose stuff. You have to be a little bit cautious with this, because if you dig in with your scalpel, you can actually cut into the leather and then you'll tear it away with this scraping motion, which would be undesirable. I didn't bother showing you any of the other cleaning of the leather, but basically it was the same procedure. The only awkward part was doing the leather from the camera back, because that is exceptionally thin, particularly at the edges where it wraps around the edges of the door, and I only had a couple of minor casualties with that, which is better than average for that sort of job. Okay, so that stuff is all scraped off there. There's a little patch here, a little circular thing. Now that is where the film advance, the sprocket shaft actually rides. That just covers the end of the hole in the casting. That can stay. That's just a plug. I think it's probably cardboard. It's certainly nothing exciting. It can stay there. So I'll just take some naphtha and give this a bit of a clean. Mostly here I'm interested in removing any oil or grease, anything that would prevent the adhesive from sticking correctly, and any of these loose powdery deposits which likewise would stop the adhesive from sticking correctly. I'm going around the outside edge of this to get rid of those white deposits, because they will certainly show against the painted surface of the camera body. And the leather is generally pretty good, except at this end. Now this is where the depth of field rings are, and of course there was grease on that, and so some of that grease is cooked out over the years and soaked into the leather and onto the leather, and so that's what a lot of that filth was at the end. So I just wanted to get that stuff cleaned off. It's certainly easier to clean the leather in this state than it is when it's on the camera and you've got obstructions to deal with. Okay, so that looks pretty good. That's ready to go on the camera, so I'll just get ready to put that in place. Now the bottom of the camera body, of course, this is, zoom out of it. My camera here has got a broken return spring on the zoom button, so it doesn't automatically stop when you're moving the zoom from one end of the range to the other. So here I'm just wiping this surface to remove any grease that I've put there from handling. And a piece of leather here, we'll glue that in place. Okay, let me apply some adhesive here. Just apply what's probably an over-generous amount and spread it out. Make sure I've got an even coverage, and make sure you get coverage right to the edges. Leather or leatherette, if it's going to peel, it peels up from the edges. It's not of its nature, it's never going to peel from the middle. One technician obviously took that principle to an extreme length, because I got one camera here to service and the leatherettes had all only been glued on the edges. There was no adhesive at all in the middle. Okay, so I've got some adhesive on there. Now I'm just taking a little bit of grease on a toothpick here and running it around the inside of that hole where the button comes through for the front of the, to release the front of the camera. That's so that any glue doesn't stick that in place. So I'll just put this in place on the bottom of the camera. Ensure that it's well stuck down there. Anytime you've got a piece of old leather going around a raised boss like that, you can be sure that the leather has shrunk somewhat, and as a result won't want to push down firmly around that boss. So I'm just making it sure that it's forced down tight there, rubbing off any excess adhesive on the surface. That's looking good. Now before I put the depth of field calculator back on there, I'll let that glue set up, which only takes minutes, and then I will clean that leather and I'll show you how I make it nice and black again. Okay, let's carry on with this. Now this leather's not in bad order. That looks pretty grey on the camera, but actually that's fairly black as leather goes. But what I would do is I use this. It's a penetrating leather dye. It's a spirit-based dye, and it is very good at blackening leather, so that when you have, normally the leather gets a bit rubbed through, you'll have seen that, the way it rubs through on the edges in particular. Well, this is very good at blackening that rubbed through leather. Now here I'm just putting a cursory wipe on there, more to demonstrate than anything else, because there's no real problem with this leather, but basically you can see it soaks in pretty much immediately. And it blackens the leather very well. Just be cautious with it. You don't want to spill that. If you spill that on your table, someone in the household's not going to be very pleased. Probably stain your fingers a lot too if you let it. Okay, well you can see that that's somewhat blacker than it was. The next thing I use is this renovating polish. It's a very pigment rich polish, and in this case this would probably do the job by itself. It's just a wax polish, probably meant for shoes and handbags and such like. As you can see, that leather's cleaned up very nicely. It's exactly what I did to the rest of the leather on this camera, because as you might recall, it was somewhat sad looking. Here are the depth of field calculator components. They've all been cleaned. You can now go back onto the camera. Alright, start here. This plate goes on. Just get some synthetic grease. This wavy washer, I'll apply some grease to that. Pop it into this ring. I'll run some round the inside edge of that for good measure. Pop that into place over the top. The centre piece, I'll just run some grease around the outside edge of that, where that thing's going to revolve. Drop that into place, and we have two screws. If I can get the screw holes lined up, that's better. That screw started. Get its mate aligned. Now I've lost my alignment now. There we go. This screw is not so happy, but it'll work. Okay, so there's our depth of field scale. That moves, it's got a nice smooth feel to it. Reasonable amount of resistance, so it's not likely to get knocked out of place. That's the base of the camera. That brings us to putting the film advance components in place. And I'll start here by putting the take-up spool into the camera. I'll apply some synthetic grease to the centre of this, the little spigot in the centre, and that spring, which keeps the tension on the take-up spool. The take-up spool's got a slot in the top surface, completely plain on the bottom. Slot goes upwards. Just push that into place. And we'll get the shaft. I'll lubricate the bush. I'm using synthetic grease here. You could use graphite grease. You can use pretty much anything that comes to hand. We'll pop this in place in the body. Now the blade here must line up with the slot in the top of the take-up spool, so there might be a bit of wriggling to get this in position. That's it. This should seat into the recess in the top of the body. And we have 3 flathead screws to hold that in position. It's a very simple Film Advance shaft. There's no anti-backup pawl or clutch or anything in there. That's just a very simple arrangement. Okay, get those 3 screws tightened up. That's our take-up spool in position. Check that it moves smoothly. That's all looking good. I think we can put the sprocket shaft in next. Well, here are the components. Don't forget that washer, most important. Or is that the right washer? I think I've got the wrong one there. Let's try that one. That should do the job nicely. Alright, let's get this assembled. It's going to apply a bit of synthetic grease to the hole here in the casting. And I'll do the same at the bottom of the camera where you can't see it. The hole there that the shaft extends down into. So here's our shaft. First off, we want the washer. I'm still not convinced I've got the right washer. Let's have another look at that one. Perhaps it was that one. The washer, then the sprocket. I've got that sprocket on upside down. Right, so this sprocket goes on that way with the plain face to the bottom. Now you can line up your holes here. I'm just checking, so I can pull that collar up till I expose the hole in the shaft. I've now got that hole in the shaft upwards towards me, and I can run that screw down into position and it should pick up that hole. It did. Right, so that's locked up, and because the holes are in line, I'll know where the other hole's going to be. So it must be in line with this one. So let's turn that to there. Try running that screw down. And it found the hole in the shaft straight away. So I'll tighten that screw up. So now we have the sprocket here connected to the shaft at the top, and the action's nice and smooth.